This short video will describe blood pressure and what is blood pressure, and also describe or mention just a couple short calculations. So we've been talking about exercise intensity and a couple different ways to look at exercise intensity or measure exercise intensity. I've already asked you to look at lactate threshold. And obviously, heart rate is a typical one that's used to measure exercise intensity, either as a percent of a person's max heart rate or using that heart rate reserve equation. Yet blood pressure can also be used as a measurement of exercise intensity, and specifically what's called the rate pressure product, or RPP. And it is a measure, or can be a measure, of how hard the heart muscle is actually working. And the rate pressure product is simply the systolic blood pressure times the heart rate. And the units are both of those units. So it's a pressure and a beats per minute. So another way to look at exercise intensity. So the other equations that we've had for exercise intensity, to calculate out heart rate as a percent of max, the target heart rate is simply 220 minus age, then times whatever intensity fraction you want. And that's going to be based on goals of the client, your goals as designing the program. We've looked at the ACSM guidelines for what's considered light or moderate or vigorous activity. So whatever fraction you want. This 220 minus age is not the most accurate equation. Actually, if you could test someone and achieve their max, that would be their max heart rate. There's also another equation with this, but it's so simple to remember 220 minus age, and for the most part, that's adequate. That other equation, so the heart rate reserve, or also called the Karvonen method, it's taking max, then minus rest, so it gives us additional information about the person's resting heart rate. And all of that times the intensity fraction, and this is typically a different intensity based on ACSM guidelines. And then that calculation, rest heart rate, is added back to that calculation. So it can be a little bit more accurate with by knowing the person's resting heart rate. So now what about blood pressure? And blood pressure, it's often called the silent killer, because one may, certainly at rest or easy exercise, one may not know if their blood pressure is too high. And it's a problem. It can lead to heart failure, heart attack, stroke, other problems. And if the heart muscle is pumping against a high pressure, that's what can lead to all these problems. If someone is sort of borderline high blood pressure, exercise may be one of the best ways to help in terms of that high blood pressure. And it's not exactly known what causes hypertension or high blood pressure. Age actually is one thing. Family history, a high sodium intake, stress, obesity, kidney problems, smoking. So there are different problems or different causes of high blood pressure, and combination of all of these. So what is blood pressure? Well, it's a pressure, and there are these two numbers, and that top number is systole, or it's the systolic blood pressure, and it's the blood pressure when the heart is contracting. So it's the pressure exerted in the blood vessels during the contraction phase of the heart. And so it's a higher number because the heart is contracting, forcing blood through those arteries. The diastolic is that bottom number. And when the heart is relaxed, so when the heart muscle or heart chambers are filling up with blood before they can contract, that's the diastolic blood pressure. And so that's a lower number. And we've all heard of 120/80. Maybe that's a typical number. Ideally, we'd like to have a blood pressure of less than 120 and less than 80. And the amount of time during diastole, so diastole is the relaxation phase, and systole is the contraction phase. The amount of time in diastole is greater, so it's not equal to the same amount of time as in systole. So we have to remember that when we calculate out a couple other equations, and these will come up later. And hypertension or high blood pressure, we've all heard of 120/80. Ideally, we'd like to be less than 120 and less than 80. And the criteria for hypertension has changed somewhat. You can look at our ACSM guidelines. We're going to use American Heart Association guidelines, and they changed theirs just in the last couple of years. And so this is American Heart Association guidelines. So here's the category on the left and the systolic number and the diastolic number on the right. And so normal or ideal blood pressure, we'd like it to be less than 120 and less than 80. And in fact, if someone has a blood pressure of 120 and it has a diastolic of 80, that's considered elevated. And now hypertension is at 130 for a systolic. So you should be aware of these blood pressure values and the new guidelines put forth by American Heart Association in terms of what are the categories. And a lot of people, 1 in 4, have high blood pressure, and it increases with age. And so here's an age group, and here's the percent hypertensive. And with aging, vessels become more stiff. So if those blood vessels are more stiff, as like during systole, for example, when blood is being forced through those vessels, they're not going to be as flexible. So that's a greater pressure inside those vessels. So that's one reason. And the treatment is to be healthy, to lose weight, watch sodium intake or salt intake, be more physically active. In our diets, probably typical American diet, we get a lot of sodium, probably too much, and you can look at it. And during exercise, blood pressure will go up. So on this graph, here's blood pressure on the y-axis in millimeters of mercury and exercise intensity, and this is aerobic exercise. So diastolic goes up a little bit or maybe stays pretty flat. Systolic goes up pretty steeply, and we'll calculate out a mean arterial pressure, so of course that goes up. So blood pressure goes up with exercise, with aerobic exercise. It goes way up with resistance training exercise. So here's rest, here's aerobic exercise, and so this would be maybe the range of systolic and the range of diastolic. Here is the range of systolic blood pressure with 2 arm curl weightlifting exercise, and here with more muscle mass, systolic blood pressure goes up even more. So if someone is hypertensive, we probably don't want them to be lifting high amount of weights. Lifting is fine for them, but it should be controlled. During recovery from aerobic exercise, blood pressure will become less than a typical resting value. So it goes up with aerobic exercise, of course, and then with recovery, it can go down below rest. And this blood pressure below rest, it can last up to 12 hours. So this can be really beneficial for people that are like borderline hypertensive, because it's a way to lower their blood pressure. And certainly, if they're borderline, you can do it without medications. That can be really, really beneficial. So this was a short video on what is blood pressure. And the next video, I'll describe sort of briefly how to measure blood pressure.